When talking about variables and expressions, it's important to understand the vocabulary there. So first, let's talk about variables. Pre-algebra and algebra, most commonly we think of x as a variable. It could be any letter, that's fine. But the important thing to remember is that it represents an unknown quantity or value. When we talk about expressions, it could be something as simple as literally saying y. More commonly, you might see something like y plus 2. The key difference in an expression and an equation is that an equation has an equal sign. So it might look something like this, where 5 equals y plus 2. But that's a later lesson. So for now, we're just worried about expressions. So as I stated before, a variable represents an unknown. Usually it's a letter. Typically, it helps to make our letter something relevant to what our problem is. So if we're talking about Madison having 4 apples, we might say Madison, or we might say 4 apples. We use A, something along those lines. And when we're talking about algebraic expressions, I would say something like Madison has 4 apples. Now notice I didn't put the M there and the A, because then that's 2 different variables. I don't want to get too confusing with that. So let's say she has her 4 apples, and then she gets 2 more apples. It would look something like 4A plus 2A. Or we could say something like she has 4 apples and 2 bananas. Now that's a great expression right there. Now it's very important to remember that you cannot just combine things because you see a 4 and a 2. You cannot say that 4 apples and 2 bananas is 6 apple bananas. That is illogical. We can only combine like terms. So let's say she has her 4 apples and 2 more apples. Now we can actually combine that 4 and that 2 because they are both of the same variable, A, which in our case represents apples. So if we had 4 apples and 2 apples, we can combine that and say there are 6 apples. So I'm going to try to work out a problem here, and I want you to work along with me. I'll pause as we go so that way you can keep up as we progress. So for our problem, we're going to talk about cupcakes and the amount that I have because they're amazing and I love them. So think of my variable first. I'm going to choose C to represent the amount of cupcakes that I have. Now, in terms of me, I'm going to talk about Mrs. Murphy. Mrs. Murphy loves cupcakes even more than I do, and she has 3 times as many. So she has 3 times the amount of cupcakes that I do. So as you can see right there, there's 3 and C. When you have a number and a variable attached together, that's like saying they're being multiplied together. That's 3 times C. So Mrs. Murphy has 3 times the amount of cupcakes I have. Notice I didn't choose a different variable to represent Mrs. Murphy. I still have me, but now I'm showing Mrs. Murphy in terms of me because she has 3 times the amount of me. C is still me and my cupcakes. Now let's say that Eliza comes along and she is obsessed with sugar. She has 5 more cupcakes than Mrs. Murphy. Now, this 3C still represents Mrs. Murphy, but now we say that Eliza has 5 more than Mrs. Murphy. So now what we can see here is that here's me, here's Mrs. Murphy because she's 3 times as many as me, and now here's Eliza because she has 5 more than 3 times the amount that I have. Whoa. Now here comes Mr. Jones. He says cupcakes are disgusting and not worth the calories. Huh. So he has 2 less than me. So there's still me, but now there's 2 less than me. So now I still have me, like I did up here, but now Mr. Jones has 2 less than me. So I'm still C, that's the amount of cupcakes I have. 2 less than me would be my cupcakes minus 2. This represents just Mr. Jones. So now let's look over this again, and you can see here that I've written a few different algebraic expressions using the same variable. So I had my original amount of cupcakes. I had Mrs. Murphy, who had 3 times as many. I had Eliza, who had 5 more than even Mrs. Murphy. Then I had Mr. Jones and his lame 2 less than me.